Hello, everyone. Today I am speaking with Dr. Michael Levin, professor of biology at Tufts University and one of the most original thinkers working at the intersection of biology, computer science, and philosophy. He is known for his research on how cells use electrical signals to coordinate and decide what to build, and for co creating Xenobots and Anthrobots, synthetic life forms that do things their ancestors never did. Today, expect to learn about why the mind might be older, wider, and stranger than we think. Later in the conversation, we go even deeper into what Michael calls Platonic space, the possibility that some patterns of behavior and intelligence may not come only from physics or biology. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe or follow on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Please also leave a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps this channel reach more people. More conversations are on the way, and following the channel is the best way to get notified about them. You can reach out to me on every social media platform with links included in the description. Now, here's my interview with Michael Levin. I hope you enjoy it. So, when people hear the word mind, they usually think of brains, consciousness, maybe language. But your work seems to suggest that mind is older, wider, and stranger than that. So, what are we getting wrong?
Well, many things. The first and most important thing, I think, is that we inherited some ancient categories, some linguistic and philosophical categories from pre-scientific times. And maybe they were important to get science off the ground at one point, but I think the fundamental phenomenon is continuous. It is not discrete. And we can talk about how to handle that, but this should, in fact, be obvious from the basic facts of developmental biology and evolution. All of us were single cells once, and the process from getting from that single cell to whatever we are now is slow, continuous, gradual. There is no sharp lightning flash where something happens and you say, boom, okay, you used to be the subject of chemistry, but now you're the subject of psychoanalysis. Okay, there's no event like that. So I think it's really important that we understand that when we're talking about a continuum, and that what we seek in science and philosophy are models of transformation, models of change, and how we metamorphose from one kind of thing to another, not these sharp categories.
So, it's not simple as mind versus non mind or intelligence versus non intelligence. So, you see it more as of a continuum across the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, it's first of all, it's absolutely not binary. I absolutely don't think it's binary. So asking questions, is it? This is how mostly people phrase it. Is it intelligent? Does it have a mind? I think that's a terrible way to do it. I think the right question is what kind and how much, and then we can sort of argue about different categories, words that we use, because there are some useful ones that we may want to use, and how far down it actually goes, and things like that. But I think it's very clear to me that it has to be a continuum. And furthermore, that claims about sharp phase transitions. So oftentimes people say, well, more is different. In other words, sometimes there are like these kind of transitions to a new some kind of a new set of phenomena or something, and that's fine, and that does happen, but that's what needs argument. It's not the continuum view that needs argument, but the continuum view is the baseline. That's the null hypothesis that we see from the facts of evolution and development. What if you think there are sharp transitions? That's what needs to, you need to make an argument for what that sharp transition really is.
So, what's the minimum work a system has to do for you to be willing to put the word mind near it?
Well, I don't use the word mind too much. I think that at least in scientific usage, I think we're far better off once we've recognized that it is a continuum, and I have my particular favorite flavor of that continuum that we can talk about. I think the real question is then, for any given system, where on that continuum do you think it is? And I think that really when we talk about these things, what we really are talking about are interaction protocols. So I don't think we're talking about essential categories. I think we're talking about when you've told me that something lives on a certain part of that continuum, what you're really telling me is what kind of tools we can use to interact with it. So I'll give you an example. And for that reason, And so I call this part of my work the TAME framework, TAME, for technological approach to mind everywhere. And it takes a particular engineering lens, because it emphasizes not sort of essential philosophical or ontological categories, but practical ways to interact with things. And so I call that spectrum the spectrum of persuadability. So the idea is that if you would like the system to do something in particular that that it doesn't already do, what are the tools that you have by which you can make that happen? And so on the left side of that spectrum, you have very simple things, mechanical clocks, let's say. And really, your only options there are physical rewiring. You're not going to convince it of anything. You're not going to make it feel guilty. You're not going to, train it. You're going to rewire the hardware, and that's the tools you have. And then you sort of move further, and then you have cybernetics and control theory, and you have things like thermostats and beyond, which have very interesting properties, where you don't have to rewire them, you have to change the set point. And in fact, you don't even need to really necessarily know how everything works, but you do have to know, A, that they're amenable to such a thing, and B, how the set point is encoded. And then they do the hard work of implementing that set point. And so this is, for an engineer, this is really important, because if I'm building with some kind of component, what I need to know is, how much autonomy does this thing have? What do I need to micromanage? What can I delegate to let this thing do? Like, that's really the key. And then you sort of move further, and you find systems that then are amenable to training. So they have learning capacity. And so now all the tools of behavior science come into play. And then further, then you have the kinds of very high-end minds that are susceptible to psychoanalysis, love, friendship, all those things. And of course, many things happen as you move across that spectrum. For example, as you move to the right of the spectrum, the amount of details you need to know goes down. So humans were training dogs and horses for thousands of years with knowing zero neuroscience, right? And that's fine, because the system hides all that stuff. That's the whole point of being a multi-scale cognitive system. And then the other thing that happens is that on the left side, it's very much a kind of a one-way control. Like, I am the engineer, I'm going to control this thing. On the right side, it's a bidirectional relationship where neither of you stays the same after the interaction. In other words, you don't just exert control. There's a back and forth, what Richard Watson would call, I think he calls it a mutually vulnerable kind of interaction, right? You're letting the system inform you as much as you're controlling it. And so I think when we talk about these things, really what we mean is, what is the set of tools that you're claiming? And that I think what's interesting about that is that it reframes this problem from some kind of a philosophical argument about essential categories and category errors and these kinds of things, which I think are silly. And then instead of that, it becomes an empirically tractable question. You make a claim, that claim implies a set of tools and approaches you're going to use. You do that, and then all of us in third-person science, all of us can see how that worked out for you. And so that's and the extent to which that worked out in terms of providing new discoveries, new capabilities, new research programs, then we can all say, yes, that's where this thing can land on that spectrum, or we say, yeah, that didn't work out. So let's refine our hypothesis.
So it's essentially protocol to understand how you can study mind. So you mentioned persuadability, autonomy, and also caring about yourself or your community. Those things that you mentioned. So it's more about what can we use to understand these minds, and so yeah. But how does the transformation in conventional terms would happen? Let's say. Okay, let's take a very silly example: stone versus human mind. So do you see differences as you go with the spectrum, increasing autonomy, persuadability, and at some point you end up saying it's a mind, intelligence, or life form?
Well, there are there are two questions in what you've just asked. One is the status of the stone and how far down do these things go, right? And two, what is it that actually scales, and how do you get scales of cognition? So let's take those separately. So the question of how far down does it go? What I can tell you is that experimentally is that already at the level of chemical reactions, so small networks of chemicals interacting with each other, you already have phenomena such as habituation, sensitization, and Pavlovian conditioning. So even a dumb set of chemicals can already do Pavlovian conditioning. Now what happens below that? My claim is that that even passive matter is not zero on that spectrum. Why is it not zero? It's extremely low on that spectrum, but why is it not zero? Well, so I'll give you an example. To me, the most important thing about being on that spectrum is, and this will become important in a minute when we talk about scaling, how you scale all these things, is goal directedness and the locus of causal control. Those are two things. So goal directedness is some degree of ability to pursue specific goals by different paths. So this is also a definition of intelligence from William James, right? That same goal by different means. And so some degree of goal directedness and causal control, which means that the things you're about to do or the things that the system is doing are not completely captured by the immediate current of set of forces that impinge upon it. Okay, so even simple particles and even inanimate matter meets those conditions because least action principles are critical throughout physics, and the fact that you can find the shortest path through some sort of gradient, people don't think that's impressive because it's so ubiquitous, and water seeks its level and they say, well, it's just like water. Like, yeah, that's not zero, that's actually something for two reasons. One is that if as an engineer, so let's imagine again, as an engineer, the question is, how much autonomy does your system have? And I point out that even a rock is not zero. If you're an engineer and you're building a roller coaster, you have to work hard to get that thing up the hill. You don't need to do anything to get it to come back down. You've saved a bunch of effort, okay? Because you know that thing does, whether you're dealing with water, a water system, or electric current, or rocks in a gravitational field. There are some things that this thing does on its own, and some of those things are kind of impressive. I mean, light finding the shortest path through a set of lenses. Like this is not zero. It's not a human mind, but it isn't zero. And so that, and then of course quantum indeterminacy. It's again not a high level kind of thing that we get in humans. Nevertheless, you already have a system that is not well captured by just simply adding up the forces, the detectable forces on it. So let's just remember that we started out by asking about the lowest level. So if we think these things are not impressive, well, we're looking for the basement version of this, but that's the basement version. So now what happens? How do you scale? So I think one of the really most important aspects of the scaling question has to do with the size of your goals. So in 2019, I had this paper on the scaling of the self, and I trotted out this idea of the cognitive light cone. So the cognitive light cone, as I define it, is not the distance you can sense or the distance you can reach with your effectors. It's not what you can see and what you can do. It's the size in some problem space. It's the size of the biggest goal you can pursue. And so what I think happens as you go up the spectrum, among other things, is an enlargement of your cognitive light cone. So let's talk about one particular example that we've studied in the lab, and this is a kind of our workhorse model that we've used for a lot of things, and that is the expansion of the cognitive light cone when you go from single cells to multicellular organisms. So when you have now keep in mind, I think that the spectrum of intelligence has gotten going long before you get to cells. By the time you get to single cells, you're kind of in the middle of the spectrum already. But the scaling, this is maybe the best example we have of how the scaling works. So consider the size of the goals of individual cells. So individual cells have a number of, and when I say goal, I don't mean a human level meta goal, such as I know what my goals are, I could change my goals. Like that's great, but that's a sort of right side competency that's a meta goal thing. I'm talking about a very simple homeostatic set point, such that there's a particular state and the system will work hard to implement that state. And if you deviated from it, it'll try to get back there by spending energy and all of that. That's what I mean. So cybernetic kinds of, parenthetically, I think it's important that, like, one reason, I think it's really interesting, one reason that people get really sort of upset about introducing this kind of agentic talk into chemistry, into cell biology, because they say, look, you're putting mystery back in where we wanted mechanism. And my point is simply, these kinds of things haven't been a mystery since the 1940s. I mean, we've had cybernetics, we've had control theory. This is not when we use this kind of agentic talk, the point isn't that this is some kind of magic that human brains have. This is none of this is going to be mysterious once we really get a grip on it. We have a good science of systems with goals. It's not magic. So the only thing that stands in our way is these ancient categories that prevent us from reusing tools from one field in another, and there should be no barriers like that. So anyway, so if we look at the homeostatic, homeodynamic, and allostatic goals that cells have, they tend to be very small things. So for example, pH level. So the cell is interested in the pH level within the cell. Maybe it tries to maintain a pH level or like in its microenvironment, but that's it. That's the state that it tries to meet. So pH level, hunger level, so metabolic states, a few other things, but they're all very small in both space and time. So you can actually plot the cognitive light cone to the extent that we do experiments. You can sort of get an idea of it, and you see how big it is in size. It's pretty much the size of a single cell. You can see how big it is in time. So they have a memory, cells like bacteria or unicellular organisms have a memory that goes back maybe 20 minutes or something. They have some anticipation potential of going forward, anticipation, 5-10 minutes or something like that. So that cognitive light cone is pretty small. Now, imagine what happens during the evolution of multicellularity. One of the key things about multicellularity, I think, and this is, I call these kind of mechanisms cognitive glue, because I think they do the work of scaling up the cognitive light cone and producing higher level minds that are composed of, at least their embodiments are composed of lower level competencies. This is partly why we're so interested in bioelectricity, because there's this interesting thing called the gap junction, which is a structure that allows it. So think of like two submarines docking with each other, right? So each cell has a little hole in the membrane, a very specific proteinaceous pore. They come together like this, and signals can go back and forth. So something interesting happens there when you connect a bunch of cells together like this. One kind of cognitive glue looks like the following. Let's say you have two cells, and let's say they're just sitting next to each other, and there's chemical signals that can go back and forth, canonical. When this cell gets poked or something happens to it, it can send a signal to this cell. But for this cell, it's extremely clear that came from the outside. That was not me. That came from the outside. So that means I can ignore it. I can do something about it. I can believe it. I can disbelieve it. I can interpret it in some way. But it's an outside thing. Now imagine instead two cells that are electrically coupled via these gap junctions. These gap junctions allow small molecule signals to go through, like electric current and calcium and things like that. Now the left cell gets poked. There's a calcium flux that basically represents that event. That calcium flux propagates to the other cell. Now, the other cell, because this comes through into the internal milieu, it doesn't come through the outside surface. That cell, it really has no idea, wait, was I the one who got poked, or is this a false memory from somewhere else? It's basically a mind meld at that point, in the sense that you're now sharing memories. It's a memory anonymization. You don't know if that's your memory or if that's somebody else's memory, because you encode memories exactly the same way, so you can interpret them that way. So what you end up doing is and there's another kind of cognitive glue, which is stress sharing, that we could talk about if you want. But these cognitive glue mechanisms basically provide a mind meld where I don't know what my memories are and I don't know what your memories are, but we both know what our memories are. And it means that you can now integrate across larger regions of space and time. So when things happen over there, everybody knows about it, and there's some rate at which they transfer, which is like the sort of the speed of light in that system, and it's like the duration of the now moment, right? And that means that the collective as a whole, and I've told obviously I'm telling an extremely simplified version. We have like sophisticated computational models. It's like a very simplified version. But the network has more computational capacity than the individual cells. The whole thing has more memory. It has more look ahead. So the cognitive light cone gets bigger. And what's important is that the cognitive light cone now projects into new spaces. So when individual cells have little tiny goals that are like scalars, so metabolic level, pH, temperature, those kinds of things. Collectives now, the cellular collective can have goals in the new space that single cells may not have access to, which is anatomical morphospace. And what do I mean by a goal in anatomical morphospace? It means that when I have a group of cells, that form a salamander limb. No individual cell knows what a limb is, or how many, or what a finger is, or how many fingers you're supposed to have. But if you amputate that amphibian limb, the cells will grow very rapidly and rebuild it, because the collective does remember. So, and why do I say this? Because we can see these now. We've developed technology to actually read memories, kind of like neuroscientists, right? Read and write memories into brains. We can now read and write some memories into non-brain tissue, and we can actually see the pattern memories that guide the movement of the gene expression, everything else in the cells. So so the collective has a memory that individual cells don't have, and the individual cells have memories that their molecular components don't have. But what it allows you to do is to project that cognitive light cone, and now your goals are enormous. It's like this giant, centimeters long state that is your goal state. And then the same tricks got appropriated by evolution in designing the brain, and we have massive cognitive light cones that are longer than even our lifespan, right? So you got people devoting their life actively working on states that for long after they're gone, worldwide economic things and whatever. So we can actually see in that example, we can actually see how the cognitive light cone grows, and how the goals of a system can project into new spaces and become larger. And so that kind of thing, the mechanisms that allow that align parts towards the goals of their higher level control system, is how you scale these things.
I'm glad we already got very technical already. Perhaps it's also a good moment to start talking about Xenobots and Anthrobots. So for the people that don't know this, so these are the synthetic life forms that you either created or co-created. So maybe let's start there. So what are these forms, and do you observe the same patterns that you just described in these life forms? I think I've seen you somewhere also speak about that, like these Xenobots, for example, start doing things their ancestors, like the origin cells, never did. And the question is, where does that behavioral competence come from? And also, it seems to be that you're also putting more emphasis on goal direction, and also goal direction in the context of what we mean by life and also intelligence and agency.
Yeah. Okay. So there's several interesting things there. I want to start with a little bit on terminology, because we want to talk about what these things are, and I just want to sort of put my philosophical cards on the table and say that say two things. First, I don't believe anything is anything. I don't believe anything is a computer. I don't think anything is a life form. All of these are formal models that we apply in certain circumstances. Sometimes they do well for us, and sometimes they keep us from seeing other things. But all of these things. So if I call them a biobot, it's not because I think they are only robots and they fully match the stories that we tell about what robots are, fully explain what's going on here. I don't believe any of that is the case. And Josh Bongard and I have developed a kind of a more rigorous framework called polycomputing, where we actually look at and quantify how different observers interpret different things, and in fact the same thing, so multiple observers can see, so we can see the same thing. And so this is just what I'm emphasizing now is the very old philosophical point of, like Magritte's painting of the pipe that says this is not a pipe, right? It's a representation, and it matches to some extent, and so on. And so I think that's important, because even with the kinds of things we all talked about, like one of the questions you had mentioned to me before was, uh, does a hard category have to exist to hold the field together, right? And my point is, the field doesn't need hard categories to hold together. The field holds together just fine. The underlying phenomena are continuous, but and we should focus on frameworks for understanding continuous change and flow. But it's fine to have specific narrow applications in which you use a specific formal model, hopefully fully understanding that that is not capturing the whole phenomenon, but for this purpose, this formal model is good. So, a dumb example that I always use with people is the notion of an adult. Okay, like if you go to court, they don't have all day every day to argue about the nature of the mind. And so you just say, okay, on your 18th birthday, you're now magically this thing called an adult. And we all know that doesn't mean anything in terms of physics or cognitive science or anything like that. But in order to like keep things moving, and they have this idea. So we have words like that too. And it depends on what your, what your purpose is. If you want synthetic living machines with specific useful applications, so they're going to clean up their environment or heal things in your body, then you say, okay, my current lens is biobots. If you're interested in evolution, if you're interested in basal cognition, if you're interested in where these things come from, which we can talk about, um, then you might have other names. And so I just want to be clear that as we talk about biobots, I am not claiming that these are that the framework that we have for understanding robots, which by the way I think is not even good for actual robots, but I'm not claiming that any of these things capture the essential phenomena. Okay, so having said that, what is the phenomenon? Well, what we've found is that when you liberate cells from their normal environment, this doesn't require any genetic editing. It doesn't require any scaffolds, no weird nanomaterials, no drugs. You just liberate cells from the normal environment, and you sort of give them a chance to reboot their multicellularity, to re-envision themselves. And then you need to observe and sort of be creative about observing what is it that that they can do with, what is it that they can do in novel environments. So we've published so far 2 examples, and we'll have a lot more. One example are called Xenobots, and there's 2 versions with and without nervous systems, but they come from skin, basically epithelial cells of early frog embryos. And so you extract them from the embryo and you put them in a little dish by themselves, and they assemble like this little thing that they have little hairs on their outer surface, and they rotate those hairs and they use them to swim against the water. So those are Xenobots, and they're called Xenobots for Xenopus laevis is the name of the frog that we got them from. And then having seen that, some people said, oh well, this must be some sort of like really weird frog embryo specific thing. And so I said, well, okay, what's the furthest you can get from a frog embryo? Well, how about an adult human? And so we got cells from adult human patients who donate tracheal epithelia, and we took those of biopsy samples and we isolated the cells, and guess what? They make little creatures too, and we call them anthrobots. Okay, and so we've been studying the anthrobots and the xenobots. I'll first tell you what we have not claimed yet. So I have not claimed any particular status, any particular cognitive status for either one, because I firmly believe that these are not things you can say from a philosophical armchair. The only thing you can say is that it's possible, and I'm going to hypothesize X, Y, Z, and then you have to do experiments to actually show it. So the only thing we've shown so far in that system that has to do with real cognition is learning. And so we've shown that Xenobots do, in fact, they can form memories of events in their environment, and we can read out those memories. Okay. However, everything else is currently ongoing. So we are absolutely testing for specific goal states. We're looking for degree of intelligence in pursuing those goal states. We're looking for preferences. We're looking at different kinds of learning. We're looking at all of that. But until we show specific instances, I don't make any claims about it. So that's important. Now, what do they do? Well, they do a bunch of interesting things. Xenobots, for example, have several hundred genes that they transcribe, new gene expression events that don't occur in the embryo. And when we analyzed those, one of the things we found was a cluster of genes related to sound perception, hearing, basically. And so we saw that upregulating a bunch of genes related to sound perception. And we said, well, that's wild. Is it possible that these things can hear? And so we put speakers underneath the dishes, and we played simple sine waves to them. And sure enough, the Xenobots, but not embryos, respond to specific sounds. Right. That's one thing. They also they do this crazy thing called kinematic self-replication. So if you sprinkle a bunch of loose epithelial cells in their environment, they go around and they collect the cells into little piles. And because they themselves are working with an agential material, the little piles become the next generation of Xenobots. And guess what they do? They run around and make the next generation. So we haven't shown strong heredity yet. So I'm not saying this is the same thing as an evolutionary lineage, but they do make copies of themselves. This is sort of von Neumann's dream of a robot that goes around and finds materials and makes a copy of itself. So Those are some interesting things about Xenobots. Anthrobots also, they're little creatures. If I showed you, and there's videos of this on my website, if I showed
Yes,
you an
yes.
anthrobot, you would never say that this has anything to do with humans. You would say I found this in the on the bottom of a pond somewhere, right? But if you sequence the genome, you see 100% Homo sapiens, which is interesting, and they do interesting things. Among them, first of all, they're younger than the cells they come from, so they actually by epigenetic clock they actually roll their age back a little bit. Second, they express 9,000 genes differently than they did in the patient. So that's half the genome about, like enormous amounts of new things going on. And they do a thing that is basically healing neural wounds. So if you plate a bunch of neurons on a dish, you take a scalpel, put a big scratch through the dish, sprinkle in some anthrobots. They run around, they find the scratch, they sit down in the scratch, and they come together in this thing we call a superbot cluster. And if you lift them up 4 days later, you see that what they were doing underneath was knitting the wound shut. They were taking the neurons and knitting them shut. So they have this like healing function, and you can imagine we're testing, of course, for their ability to heal all kinds of other things. And so that, someday in the patient repair, you don't need immunosuppression because they'll be your own cells. They're not genetically modified. I mean, they can be if you want, but they don't need to be. And they have, a billion years of experience with healing and stress and inflammation and all of that. So okay, so those so applications, and so those are the kinds of things. But then you ask the very important question, and this is like I'll just give a hint, and then I'll pause, and then you see where you want to go. Where do these things come from? The properties that they have. Okay, whatever capacities they have, and so we can talk about that. I have some really kind of weird and unusual with ideas about where it comes from. But I'll just point out that the question is really critical, because for standard plants and animals, when you ask where do its properties come from, we have this wonderful theory of evolution that says there is a tight correspondence between the properties you have now and the set of environments in which you've been selected for eons. The whole point of the evolution is that there's a specificity to the reason you look the way you look now is because your ancestors for eons have done this or that. Okay. And so we kind of tend to say, well, that's the explanation because there is no other viable explanation. But now, and this is partly why I made these systems, is to try to crack that assumption, because now we're looking at creatures that have never been here on Earth. They never face selection. I mean, the cells, of course, they're made of living cells. Of course, the cells face selection, but there was never pressure to become good at kinematic self-replication. No other creature on Earth does kinematic self-replication. I don't think they ever did. There was never a scenario where our ancestors were little bots running around some other larger creature healing their neural wounds. That just didn't happen. Now, what's cool is you can imagine sort of synthetic fake worlds for these things that would be different. Is that okay? If we did evolve, what kind of world would they have evolved in? And we have a project on that. It's kind of partly an art project, but there have, you can't paint a picture of all these things from previous selection forces. Nothing about their environment predicts this, and it's the kind of thing where once we show them, then people look to see and they say, well, I guess I guess that's what cells do in that environment. That's great after we've done it. But no one could have looked and told us why these 9,000 genes, they were going to do hearing. Like nobody saw this coming. And so you can't just say, at the time you select for being a good frog or being a good human, well, you also get Xenobots and Anthrobots. I mean, that rips up the whole point of the specificity of evolutionary theory. We need to do better than that as in science. So that's it. That's why I think it's such an important question, and also the computational cost, because we know when we paid the computational cost of designing humans and frogs in the millions of years of the genome bashing against the environment. But when did you pay the computational cost of designing an amazing anthrobot to do these things, or the Xenobot? Like, that's a real question. We need to understand the accounting of effort versus what you put in versus what you get out, and ask the question of, do our current formalisms of computation, of biology, of physics, do our current formalisms do that accounting math correctly? And I don't think they do. So I'll stop there, but that's the idea.
I hope you're finding this conversation interesting, and if so, please subscribe or follow on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple to get notified about future episodes. Please also leave a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps the channel reach more people. Now back to the conversation. It's really interesting. Just to summarize for my own understanding also, so we have these cells, we take them from their original environment and we put them into novel environments, and then we observe some of the new set of behaviors that we wouldn't observe if they were in their original environment. We don't know if it is an intelligence, if it's mind. We just need to make a more research to understand it. But yes, that's the next natural question for me. Where do those sets of behaviors, novel sets of behaviors, come from?
Yeah, so okay. Let's talk about that. I just want to say one thing about the way you just summarized it. I mean, that's accurate. The only thing I'll say about novel environments is it's subtle. If the environment was some kind of crazy new thing with, you could say, okay, well, you've just engineered it with these weird signals from the environment. But let's just look at what the actual environment is. So in the case of the Xenobots, the environment is light salt water. That's the environment, exactly as for embryos. They're in a dish. They're in an empty dish of water with a little bit of salts in it, like that pond water. Basically, that's it. That's the new environment. So it's very hard to pin the specificity on the environment. It's not like we've engineered this crazy set of inputs that then leads them to express new genes. You basically put them in the same environment. There's no way you say, salt water, well then kinematic replication, like that's not going to do. So the one thing we did do, however, was pull them away from the normal cells, which basically force them to be a boring sort of outer layer on the frog surface. So it's kind of an engineering by subtraction. And this I think is important. By releasing the normal controls, you see what does the material want to do on its own. Because I think all of biology is basically subsystems hacking each other. So every component is interpreting and trying to control every other component in the system. So by removing that, you get to find out what are the intrinsic behaviors, right? And the same thing with the Anthrobots. The Anthrobots, they go into a basically a cell culture medium and some, at first some matrix, some matrigel, but that's it. It's not that different from a human body. So you can't pin too much on the environment. So the question ends up, where does it come from? So, okay, there's a few different ways that I try to make this argument, and this is like the most recent work in our lab. I've been thinking about this for many years. I haven't talked about it until 2025, because last year basically is when these things became experimentally actionable, I think. And so this is why now I think it's relevant to talk about these things. In the question, so I'm very interested in this question of where do things come from at all? Where do they come from in computational systems? Where do patterns come from in mathematics and in biology? And very importantly, I want to formalize, because come from is a kind of a philosophically fuzzy category. I want to formalize that by saying, how much effort did you need to put in? So in some form, and this will become important shortly. But we're often given these like no free lunch theorems, and this idea that you always have to pay for it in some sort of effort. And the question is, what kind of effort, and do we do that accounting correctly? So the question you could start with is, okay, if I just make an accounting of everything that happens in the physical world, so all the energetic phenomena that happen in the physical world, so I count up everything that physics knows about and everything that physics can know about, does that basically take into account everything that it could possibly be? Is the physical world the source of whatever I'm interested in understanding? Is the source of it going to be in the physical world somewhere? So that's really the question of physicalism, right? Is the physical world the only thing that matters? So I want to point out that it's been known for a really long time that that's false, right? We know it's false, because there are, even though most scientists, I think certainly most biologists, I think assume it's true, but we know that there are important facts that are not physical facts. These are the simplest example that I can give you, and then we'll generalize from there. The simplest example is mathematics. So there are facts of mathematics. The fact that complex numbers don't behave quite the same way as quaternions, or the fact that there's all these weird truths of number theory, and the fact that if you want roots of equations, you have a formula that goes up to 5, I think, and after that you can't. After that, there's no formula. Y5, Y5. These kinds of things. There are these kinds of facts, and what makes them non-physical facts are two very specific things. One is that you don't find them with the methods of physics. You can't just disband the math department and say that the mathematicians will figure you can't disband the math department and say that the physicists are going to figure all this out. Okay, and two, there is nothing you can do in the physical world. So let's say you're tweaking constants at the beginning of the Big Bang. So you have the half dozen or whatever magic numbers that define the properties of the universe. There's nothing you can do in those numbers to change the shape of a particular fractal, to change the digits of E, right? These things are not going to change by any of the means that we have for in physics. So we have to already say that there are some important structures that are not part of physics. So that's my first claim. And this has been Pythagoras and so on have said this for the longest time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that while these things are not discovered by or changeable by physics, the fact is that they often serve as explanations for what happens in physics. So one of the things that impresses me significantly is that wherever you start, biology, physics, it doesn't matter, wherever you start, if you do the thing that 5-year-olds do and you're just saying, okay, but why? But why? Every time you get an answer, you're like, but why that? If you do that, eventually you end up in the math department, because no matter what happens, you will eventually come to, well, it's because of the symmetry group of this abstract object. That's why the fermions do what the fermions do. And if you here's a biology case, the cicadas come out at 13 and 17 years. Why? Oh, it's because they're trying to time it so that the predators don't get them. Great. So why those specific numbers? Because they're prime. Well, why are they prime? Now go to the math department. They'll tell you why it's prime. So that's how everything ends up. Everything eventually ends up like that. So that's very interesting. It means that not only are there important patterns that are not patterns of physics, these patterns serve an explanatory role for why specific things happen in physics and biology. They are and for me, that's a really important part of causation. I don't think you can say that these are just things that sort of humans invented, because they are the actual explanations for what happens. And also, most of them we don't have any choice about. I mean, it's true that if aliens started somewhere else in math, they would see different theorems and whatever. But once for us, you start with like simple logic or simple set theory. You say, okay, there's an empty set, and then there's a successor of one object, right? And before you know it, you get a very specific value for the natural logarithm. You didn't get to choose that. You were committed to that the moment you started with this like very simple stuff. And so much like certainly not all mathematicians believe this, but like many mathematicians have this Platonist view that you discover these things. You don't invent them as a human, you discover them. And I think that's true. So, okay, so what does all this have to do with Anthrobots and Xenobots? Well, the standard view of these things, even among the Platonist mathematicians, the standard view is that, okay, there are some patterns like that, but they're only relevant for what we call math. In other words, these things that we discover are kind of static, low agency patterns that exist, and they're important to mathematicians, but that's it. Everything else is, we should have conventional explanations. So my thinking at this point, my hypothesis is that there are patterns that are like, sort of maybe permanently unchanging things like the value of E, these kind of things. But there are also other patterns that are much more dynamic and higher agency that we would recognize as behavioral propensities, aka kinds of minds. So the idea here basically is that, yeah, there's a space of these patterns, and the space is, first of all, really critical, not random. I mean, mathematicians don't think the space is random. They think they're investigating. It's a structured space of possibilities that they're investigating systematically. I found this thing, and that helped me find this thing, and this thing we now know is connected to this other thing. It's a structured space. It seems crazy to me when I ask, like in biology, when you say, so why is this thing doing that? And they say, well, it's emergent. And I said, well, what does that mean? What does it mean that it's emergent? They say, well, these are just regularities that hold in our world. So, like random, no underlying structure.
So
As to
you are
what?
saying that answer is not enough. So when we use what we have in biology, physics, if we follow the traditional tools that we have, we can describe what they do. But if we keep asking why, we never find an answer, and then we end up in mathematics department.
Yeah, I mean, I think the standard answer for these kinds of things is emergence, right? So if I say, why is this happening? And if there isn't a good explanation, people say it's emergent. And so there's only two things that can happen after that. Either at some point you find out that there's a deeper reason, and so then what? Then you say, well, it's not emergent anymore. So I mean, to that extent, emergence is just a statement of surprise. It just means we didn't see this coming. I mean, I don't find that useful. Or you could bite the bullet and you say, look, there are just some things that are true in this world. They don't have an underlying explanation. So the latent space of possible outcomes is random. There is no order to it. And why why this thing is a hexagon versus something else is there is no further explanation to be had. At least I think that's at least more honest than emergence. But I think it's extremely pessimistic, and it's not how we do science. I mean, you don't assume upfront that things are a mystery. You assume there's an underlying order, and then you try to dig it out, and then you succeed or fail. So I think what's important is, just like the mathematicians believe, the latent space is structured, it's ordered, but I think it contains a very wide range of patterns. Some of these patterns are not things that are studied by mathematicians, although maybe they should be as well. They're things that are studied by what we call behavior scientists or cybernetics or something else. And so my current view is that first of all, that what's actually happening in the physical world is that everything we build, so embryos, biobots, machines, quote unquote, simple or complex, I mean, everything is an interface to some subset of patterns from that space. I think these patterns basically ingress through physical interfaces that are made for them. I think we are terrible at predicting when that's going to happen. I think we underestimate that like crazy. I think even extremely simple things that we make host patterns that are much more complex. We've done work on very simple sorting algorithms, and I did that specifically because I wanted the shock value of saying, here's this thing that's completely transparent. All the mechanisms are known. It's 6 lines of code. People have studied this for 80 years. Every CS undergrad has to study these things, and no one noticed because we assumed that it only does the thing you ask it to do. And I think that's, even those simple systems, I think that's false.
Just to
So
clarify, when you mentioned that space, is it the same thing that I've heard you argue what you call Platonic space?
that's what I'm talking about. The terminology is difficult. I called it Platonic space. The benefits of calling it a Platonic space is that the mathematicians immediately know what you're talking about. So it connects you to a body of work going back thousands of years, and people understand what's going on. The downside is that it has some baggage, and I'm not sure. I'm no scholar of Plato, so I'm not exactly sure if anybody knows exactly what he thought. But some of the focus on these forms being eternal, unchanging, already pre-existing, some of that is baggage that I reject. And so from that perspective, calling it Platonic may not be great, but I didn't really want to start by inventing a new word for it, because I think fundamentally the Platonist mathematics stuff is like the right foundation for this. So I'm sticking with that for now. At some point I may need to change it, but for now that's, and yes, that's what I'm talking. Yeah. And we had, it's funny, we had it's up on my blog. We have this symposium on the Platonic space. It started by, I mean, nobody talks about this stuff. Certainly nobody in biology wants another realm to worry about, right? I thought I wanted to put up my talk on this topic, and there's one other group from the machine learning community that studies this Platonic representation hypothesis, right, which they found in the work. I thought it was just going to be us and them. I thought there would be two talks, and that would kind of be it. And then as I started talking about it more, we found a whole bunch of people that actually are really interested in this and haven't had a chance to talk about it elsewhere. There's, I think, now like 30 talks on that site. There's some really, and I'm not most of them don't agree with me, but which is fine. But there's a lot of interesting thought around these issues. Like I think it's an emerging field at this point.
I know you want to change the name, but you can already guess why. But I actually love this phrase, Platonic space. And when you mentioned symposium also, because this is one of the works that Plato had. Yes, it was called symposium, where they were discussing the meaning of love among all those philosophers. But okay, when we mention this space, this structure space, which we can call Platonic spaces, is this something literally real and mind-independent space, or useful framing story that we are trying to tell us ourselves to map out all these regularities that we are seeing?
Yeah, two important things about that. First of all, I think all we have are metaphors that we try to understand the world by. I don't think there's a distinction. People ask me this all the time. Is that literally or metaphorically? There is no literally. Everything is a metaphor. I don't know. People say, well, pathways like molecular pathways. No, molecular pathways are absolutely a metaphor. We don't have contact with the real thing, at least not in third person science. All we can do is come up with metaphors and then pressure test them to see what does each metaphor hide and what does it let you see. So from that perspective, I don't think this is different than anything else in science. So is it a story? Yep, and so is everything else. So I don't think it has a different ontological status than when we talk about pathways and circuits and networks, and it's like that. Is it real? I think it's as real as anything gets, because as an engineer, what's real to me as an engineer? Anything that I need to worry about and anything that I can exploit. That's what's real. And these patterns from the Platonic space are, I think, extremely good fits to that, because not only do they give you what I call free lunches, and we could talk about the research that we're doing there, but also they give you a bunch of stuff you have to worry about that you maybe didn't know you had to worry about. And so they're as real as anything that we're going to deal with. However, as I started out by saying, this is not part of the physical world. So if your idea of real is only things that physics can handle, then this is something else. But I think we already were in that land from mathematics long ago. And I think you need to tweak our concepts of causation, because people are still largely sort of implicitly stuck with this billiard ball notion of causation, where one physical thing sort of knocked this other physical thing. And that is not how I think these patterns from the space are absolutely causal. I don't think they're epiphenomenal. I don't think they're human inventions. I think they are causal functional agents. But when you look at the causation, how the causation works, one end of that is non-physical and one end is physical, which means our standard models of billiard balls of energy conservation, those things are not applicable here. We need new models, and we're working on that. So I think it's as real as anything is real. And I think if you're an engineer, you should be paying very close attention to these things.
All right, let's go deeper to that Platonic space. So what is in that Platonic space? How can we access it? Are there any tools through which we can see it, borrow something, or yeah, we can just go very deep there?
Okay. First of all, what do I? And so, just to be clear, a lot of this is very cutting edge stuff. So I'm not strongly, I'm not making super strong claims at this point. I'm saying, well, here are the hypotheses that we're investigating. So there are many things that we don't know about this. But here's what I think is going on. What I think is going on is that, first of all, I don't think that we are fundamentally physical beings that occasionally get impacted by these extra free lunches from the space. We are forms ourselves. Okay, we are the patterns that are embodied through a human-like interface, and we have two ways to interact with others. We can interact in the third person, so in the physical world. So I interact with you. Both of us go through our physical interfaces, and we can interact in this world. Or sometimes there are lateral interactions. So when a mathematician is considering the, amplituhedron or whatever it is, that's two different forms sort of interacting in that separate space directly without having to go through a physical space of experiment and whatever. So I think the space contains kinds of minds. Some of these are very simple things. Some of these are very sophisticated things. Some of them, I suspect, might be things we've never seen before, and maybe some of that is relevant to AIs, and we can talk about that separately. But I think the space is very vast, very contains some very exotic kinds of things that we find hard to visualize. And there are many things I don't have data on. I can't tell you whether it's sparse or dense. I can't tell you whether it's infinite. I can't tell you, I do suspect strongly that it's not frozen, that the reason that these things are ingressing through the physical world is because it allows some sort of change, so maybe not, maybe E doesn't float off, but the rest of us, I think, do change by our interaction through the physical world. So I think there is some kind of a, change going on there. And okay, and so now the question is, how do we study all this? So there are two ways. There are basically two kinds of models that we are using, and the question that underlies all this is, what does that space actually offer you? Like, what do you get? What are these free lunches? So we know it offers you static patterns. We know that. Does it offer dynamic patterns? Does it offer algorithms? Does it offer virtual machines? Could you actually do compute in that space, right? There's a whole set of things it might offer. So that is what we're studying. And the way that we're doing it is by trying to quantify exactly this notion of effort, of what did you put in and what did you get out? And the question is, does our do our standard formalisms for how we account for effort, do they actually correctly predict all the things that you're going to get? And I think the answer is very much no. So we have two model systems for doing this. The first model system is biologicals. So you can look at Anthrobots and Xenobots, and my guess is this will be relevant to even conventional evolved forms. I think all of them are relevant, but the Anthrobots and the Xenobots show this most starkly. The problem there is that in biology, you can't prove it. You can never prove anything. In other words, it's complex. You never know that you've got all the mechanisms. There's always some kind of, I don't know, quantum microtubule or something that you haven't, discovered yet. There's always like deeper mechanisms that you don't have. So it's really hard to make sort of definitive claims. And also, it's really hard to quantify anything. How much effort, like we can intuitively understand that. Yeah, the standard frog had a lot of computational effort leading up to it, but the Xenobot, not clear at all that happened. But you can't really, it's hard to quantify it. So, but on the other hand, the things you get are very impressive. So one of the simplest ones that we can think about is, or like, the oldest ones is, isn't it amazing? And I mean, nobody thinks it's amazing because we know how it turned out, but if you sort of step back, isn't it amazing that by selecting mammals that can survive in the African savanna, eventually you get something that can reason about quantum chemistry and okay, now having seen that happens, everybody says, well, maybe if you're smart about one thing, eventually you're smart about everything. It's nothing to see here. But I don't know. I sort of run this experiment like if I was an alien and somebody came to me for investment and said, okay, I want $1 million space dollars and I'm just going to select for survival on the savannah, and don't worry, and sometime they'll do quantum chemistry, I would not be funding that project. I would say, well, what the hell makes you think that that's ever going to work? That just doesn't seem plausible. But we can't prove anything, right? These things you can't really prove anything. So the other thing that we do is make very minimal computational systems. When you make a minimal computational system, you know exactly what you've put in. There's no mystery about the mechanisms because you see the code, you know what you have, and you can quantify what you got out. Like what's the degree of performance, behavior, whatever of this thing, right? So now things become very interesting. And so we have a variety of, so the only thing that's published on this so far, but we have probably half a dozen papers coming in the next year. The only thing that's published is the sorting algorithm business. And what we basically found out is that yeah, it sorts the numbers all right, like it's supposed to. So there's no magic. The CPU isn't doing extra, weird shit. It's like this is some sort of quantum effect. Like the CPU is doing exactly what you think it's doing. But looking at the actual algorithm is a very poor guide to all of the things that it can do, because at the same time that it's sorting the numbers, it does a bunch of other stuff. And this other stuff, it isn't just complexity. It isn't just unpredictability. It isn't just perverse instantiation. It isn't like we all knew that simple things can give rise to complex behaviors. This is that like that's been known for a long time. What I'm pointing out is that some of the things that show up are not just complexity. There are things that are recognizable to any behavioral scientist. For example, bubble sort does delayed gratification. Nobody knew that because it's not in the algorithm. There are no steps for this. It does a bunch of other stuff. It does clustering, which looks a lot like homophily in biology. And again, there are no steps in the algorithm for this. So it's not that once you've seen it, you can't say, well, I guess that's an emergent feature of this algorithm. You can say that, but we have the formalism is there's a certain amount of effort that it takes to make certain things happen. And that effort comes in three forms typically. One is you write the algorithm. So somebody else knew how to solve it and you put that into steps and like that's how. Two, evolution, meaning nobody knew, but we generated trillions of variants and kept the good ones and threw away the bad ones. And so there you are. So evolution, then that's the other way to do it. And the third way is learning. Like, yeah, you've seen this problem a lot of times. You took your lumps and finally you figure out how to do it. My point is those three things apparently do not exhaust all the sources of policies. So there are things that happen that are not explainable in any useful way. You can accommodate them after they're found, kind of like epicycles. You can sort of pile epicycles on things and just say, well, maybe that's what happens. But if you want to do science and say, okay, but we have a theory of how we write algorithms, we have a theory of how we compute, we can estimate the computational, the physical cost, the thermodynamic cost of computations. We have theories for all this. Why did they not see any of this coming? And what are they not capturing? And so we have now a bunch of other work that's coming that basically shows that kind of frozen inside all sorts of very simple like data patterns and things like this. If you give them a body, so what that's a robotic body, either physically robotic or in silico simulation, you can unlock their behavioral potential, and you can see that there are patterns there that are not what you expected. And just to be clear, I want to sort of paint a picture of the whole thing, because once the goalposts move a lot. Every time we show something, then people sort of recalibrate their expectations and then say, well, I guess that's what it does. So now that's my expectation, right? And so let's just take the big picture view. If I wrote an algorithm for, I don't know, with the fine, it's a sorting algorithm, sorts of numbers, and I showed you that actually that also implements Microsoft Excel, you would be shocked. This is not something that you would say, yep, fine. Now I guess now that's the expectation. That would be incredibly shocking. So now the question is, at what point, what does it actually have to do before people say, yeah, that was not supposed to happen? Because we know there's a right end of this curve where nobody in their right mind would say, yeah, that's fine. We know when you write like this one algorithm, yeah, it also does, it also plays Doom or whatever. Like, and that's not how we do algorithms. So the question is, well, what do they do? And that's what we've been studying. So what we've been studying is how off, if you make an estimate based on the learning, the evolution, and the design of these things, how off are you? How much do you miss from what actually is going to happen? And whatever that delta is, whatever the delta is from what you put in and what you got out, that's the free lunch from this Platonic space. And so what we can do is we can look at that delta and we can say, what does that look like? Does it look like a static pattern? Does it look like a policy? Does it look like free compute? What does it look like? So that's how you get to it.
Yeah, just to summarize again for my own understanding, is that okay? So the same kind of patterns, same kind of minds, or whatever we might call it, that you observe in these Xenobots and Anthrobots is not. You also observe similar kind of patterns in algorithms, And that kind of connects with your earlier idea that we cannot have these strict categories: biology, computer science, physics, if you want to understand what's happening here. The next question then, okay, so these, we get the free lunch from Platonic space. Is there any possibility of us as researchers or creators of these or observers of these novel behaviors, can we manipulate that Platonic space? Maybe it's a very theoretical and speculative. I understand that, but what, maybe if we have any evidence, latest evidence or future directions in that regard?
Yeah, well, two things I want to say. First, I just want to be clear. It's not. I'm not arguing that here are some Xenobots, therefore Platonism. That's not my argument at all, right? This is a much big. They're a model system that I think is allowing us to investigate this. But there's no one experiment that proves this. And I think it's very important too as a criterion. I think we have to agree on what these what the success criteria are. So I think it's very important that the success criteria is not Monday morning quarterbacking, where somebody does something and you look at it and say, yeah, all right, I think I can accommodate this in my system. I can stretch some things and it'll be fine. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for something that helps you do the right experiment in the first place. That says, yeah, you would never have done this, which is a bunch of stuff that we've done, where you would never do this under the standard model. But with this, weird way of thinking about it, now it leads to new experiments. That's what I want. As a scientist and engineer, I want mental frameworks that lead you to do new experiments that you otherwise wouldn't have done. And so that I think is critical. Okay, so
you're not interested in literally understanding whether there is a space called Platonic space. You're not really interested on that, but you are interested in creating a model that will help you create the experiments to understand these patterns, behaviors, and minds. So,
well, I would put it slightly differently. I would say that first of all, I'm uninterested, maybe because I don't understand in what the people call ontological status. So people argue, so what is the ontological status? I'm like, I don't know what that means. I don't know what you do with that. I don't know what the ontological status of anything is really. What I do know is that there are metaphors that are good and bad in certain circumstances, and I want new metaphors that are going to unlock better ways of relating to these systems. And not just in an engineering way, but I actually think this is very important for ethics, for human flourishing. Our mind blindness, our inability to see minds and other embodiments, our I think very poor ideas of what we ourselves are, like very wrong ideas that lead to the meaning crisis and things like that. Like these are all fundamentally important, and I think better scientific tools can get us there. But I don't know what people are arguing about when they fight about ontological status and stuff like that. So from that perspective, it's a very pragmatic view. But I'm also not saying that this is all some sort of formal symbol manipulation and I don't actually think reality exists or that there is no Platonic space. No, I think we can do better or worse at approximating what the universe is all about. And I hope we're moving in a better direction. I don't think we're going to hit the end of it in any way, but I think we're sort of improving upon what we've had before. So I do think we're sort of unveiling new pieces of reality, whatever that is. So now with respect to managing this Platonic space, I don't know to what extent we can change its contents, although I do think that by providing different experiences for the patterns that ingress, inevitably you then change the state of that space. So I think indirectly we absolutely do. But I do think that there's a very rich research program around, and I think this maybe will be one of the sort of AI proof jobs of the future, is there's a very rich research program in understanding the mapping between the physical interface you build and what patterns come to inhabit it. And in many of the systems that we build, and I'm talking about quote unquote machines, I'm talking about AIs, I'm talking about social structures, financial structures, all kinds of stuff that we build. All of these are potential hosts for a wide range of patterns. Some of them we want, and some of them we really don't want. And I think learning what the mapping is between what you build and what shows up is really critical so that we can figure out to what extent we can manage that process. and enhance it in the cases where you want to enhance it, and suppress it in the cases where you don't want extra competencies cropping up. There's a couple of features to this. One is that I don't think these things, like I think our theory of uh, computation at all in the thermodynamics of computation, I don't think they capture all this stuff, because when you look at the bubble sort, you can there's a set of steps that you pay for, computational steps that you pay for, that does the sorting, but the other stuff that it does, there are no extra steps for it. It's free in the sense that you didn't have to do any extra compute for it. So the accounting that we're doing isn't right, and that means that you can't just track the energy. And it's also not the same as looking for bugs. These are not bugs. It's not the same as looking for the hidden code or whatever. It's not any of that. It's the same relationship, I think, as the relationship between math and physics. The fact that when you look at specific physical things, and the answer is, oh, it's because this mathematical object has a symmetry group or whatever. It's that type of causation. And I think it's the same exact relationship as between the mind and the brain. I think what we call mind are basically these kinds of patterns, and I think they ingress into bodies and brains and various other things in the same way that simple mathematical patterns ingress into simpler physical phenomena. I think it's exactly the same thing. So that means that what we can do as engineers and biologists and architects of societies and of our personal lives and whatever, we can ask by the things that we're making, what patterns are we pulling down? And maybe this was part of what Plato meant when he was talking about some patterns. You got patterns for like the natural logarithm, but you also got patterns for beauty and truth and altruism and these kinds of things. I don't know, I don't know if that's the case, but it seems totally plausible to me that those kind of more abstract high level patterns are also accessible by things we build. But for sure, we can start to in starting with simple computational systems, we can start to get a handle on what kind of behavioral ingressions we're going to get, and whether this is something we want and can benefit from, or something that we absolutely don't want.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, these are all very interesting topics. So, for example, just as a non-expert, when I look at the human evolution, history of humanity, so you have, I mean, you mentioned earlier Homo sapiens, what was the cause that resulted in that first Homo sapiens deciding to create a tool, and then after several millennia, we end up with railroads, planes, and everything. So if you just say, okay, this was evolution and this was just a long time and we had bigger brain and that was the reason, doesn't seem to be enough. And that's why I find your work really interesting, is that there is this connection with the Platonic space, and maybe something that we borrow from there that can explain all the crazy developments that we have seen throughout history.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the couple of pieces here are that, first of all, there's a symmetry, and this is a related part of our work, some of it with Chris Fields, is that there's a real symmetry between thoughts and thinkers. So the other thing I think that's limiting about the standard computational paradigm is this idea: well, you got your data and then you got your machine, and so the data is passive, and the Turing machine, the machine does the hard work and processes it. So I think this is again a false distinction, that it's useful for many things, but there are scenarios where that holds you back. And if you get into this idea that we are patterns too, we are temporary metabolic patterns, and I tell this like science fiction story about creatures from the core of the earth that come up, and we don't look solid to them at all. We look like little whirlpools in the thin plasma around this space, right? So it's all relative. The idea that different kinds of patterns can have different degrees of agency, and the higher agency ones can spawn off. Thinkers can have thoughts which are also thinkers that can spawn off other thoughts, and so on. Then we can ask these questions of how many of the things that we are doing are not created from scratch, but are in some way facilitated. And this is part of the work. Like I'm doing a lot of stuff now on inspiration, and what do we mean by inspiration? When you think through a problem and you get an answer, whether you laboriously calculated step by step, or whether you were visited by an amazing symphony that, if you talk to creatives who write whether poems or a music or whatever, they'll say, I was sitting there and like this thing came and I wrote it down, like that's it. Or whether it's, whether you're von Neumann, you can just sort of see the answer right away, or whether you're Ramanujan and you think a Hindu goddess whispered these theorems in your ears or whatever. This question of like how much of it is created versus facilitated, right? And I'm not saying that there's a pattern for the Boeing 747 hanging around. I actually have no idea what the real specificity to these things is, but many of these things may in fact not be like straight up constructions like we think. But the other piece of this is that I think it's interesting that we don't really need to do anything to get the right to get these patterns to come through. As far as I can tell, they are under significant pressure to like positive pressure. If you make an interface that's compatible, there it is. Like these things will be there. So maybe, and I know there are like lots of thinkers over the centuries who have said stuff like this, but now I think it's experimentally becoming tractable. Maybe there's an actual pressure for certain things to come into the world, and maybe there's some kind of a positive feedback loop where prior to actually existing in the physical world, there may be influences that are exerted to make their ingression more probable or more possible in the future. And we actually have some work on this coming out soon. Federico Pagozzi and my group and I have been looking at origin of life models and computational models of the origin of life. And there's some very interesting stuff that happens before replicators appear. So before you get a replicator that then can do Darwinian selection and can, then you can ask questions like, does it persist? Does it leave copies? Before any of that happens, there's some very interesting stuff that's already detectable that may be part of this positive feedback loop. So maybe it will help explain some of the things that happen in our history, not just from our perspective, but from the perspective of other patterns. Yeah. But in any case, all of that is really hard to prove, which is why the minimal computational models are valuable.
What's your vision with your research? If we can speculate the things that you can discover in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, we can also discuss very practical stuff. I know you talked in somewhere else about cancer prevention and so on. So what's the vision?
Yeah. Look, timelines are impossible to give. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what happens to funding. I don't know what happens with AI. I can't tell you what is going to happen timeline wise, but in my lab, it's a high priority for me that all of these philosophical ideas become practical applications that to help people. Not only because they are actually making life better for people, but also because to me that's the real arbiter of whether we're on the right track. So philosophical arguments only get settled by technology. So that's what Chris Field says that, and I think he's right. And I think ultimately, if you can draw a straight line from saying, look, here's a new formalism, and look, here's a set of engineering competencies and some biomedical stuff that came from it, like that's it. That tells you you're on the right track. So in my lab, we I would say 3/4 of the lab is wet lab. So we do applications in regenerative medicine, so birth defects, organ regeneration, cancer, aging, degenerative disease. We have applications in all of these different things. So I don't think this is sci-fi stuff that's decades away. I mean, some of it is like I'm hoping to take some of this to the FDA hopefully soon. The human suffering out there and non-human, ecological, everything else is massive. And these are very practical things that I think are going, like I think are going to be out and available at some point soon.
So can you speak more about that when you mentioned human suffering? So how do you plan to address that?
Well, specifically, for example, there is an incredible amount of disease out there that is basically all boils down to the same thing: our inability to communicate with cell groups. So if you could talk to a group of cells in some fashion and convince them to build one thing instead of another thing, you would automatically solve birth defects, traumatic injury, cancer, aging, degenerative disease. Like all of that would be gone. There would still be some things left. There's some psychological and some like metabolic things that I don't know how to address, but the rest of it would all be solved by that. So what I think is that our and other people's efforts to create communication interfaces that allow us to better communicate with unconventional minds. This is like for years I've been working on this bioelectric technology, and so we've had all kinds of amazing results in terms of producing new organs and normalizing tumors and fixing birth defects and whatever. And this is all in, of course, not yet human. This is all in animal models. But for years, I've been positioning this all like, well, it's just, regenerative medicine, just biophysics, we're just like making these things happen. But what I really think is going on is that we're using the bioelectric layer as just an interface to the native intelligence of the cells and tissues to re-specify their goals. And this is a communication act like any other communication act, where the idea is not to micromanage the molecular details. The idea is to talk to the highest level possible, and then it will handle like all the downstream events. And this is we've shown this experimentally many times. And so and so building those interfaces and understanding that what we're doing here is not micromanaging molecular biology any more than when I talk to you now, I don't worry about your synaptic proteins. I have no idea what your synaptic proteins are doing. I don't need to. We have this thin interface. I give very high level prompts. You take care of the rest, and the same thing happens with each of us every day in voluntary motion. So when you wake up in the morning and you have these crazy abstract financial, social goals, whatever, in order for you to get up and walk and do those things, ions have to cross muscle cell membranes. Like chemistry has to dance in tune with this high level abstract stuff, and that's what our bodies are very good at. It's a multi-scale transduction system to do that. So that we're taking advantage of that same thing here, and so we've had applications using very high level prompts to grow eyes and to regenerate limbs and grow spinal cords and fix very complicated birth defects and things like that.
Michael, thank you so much. That was all from my side in terms of questions. I really enjoyed talking to you today, and I enjoy following your research. I think you are one of the most unconventional thinkers out there, and it's great that we have you are following this. And good luck, keep on going. And I'm gonna follow. I'm really excited on what's gonna happen in the future in this field.
Fabulous. Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. Thank you for the conversation. And be well.
Thank you for listening or watching. If you want to stay updated on future episodes, you can follow the channel on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple. Please also consider leaving a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps the channel reach more people. And feel free to leave a comment if you have any personal thoughts on the topics we discussed. More conversations and solo episodes are on the way in the coming weeks, and following the channel is the best way to be notified about them. You can reach out to me on every social media platform with links included in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.